Hello, and welcome to the Delta Dialog, where we will talk about open data, open medical data, and AI from above and beyond, and explore its implications to our world. In this episode, we will discuss the focus of open access of data and some of the challenges regarding the age-old question of quality versus quantity. I'm Emir Mustafa, and I'm your host today. My co-host and commentator David Wood is one of the pioneers of the smartphone industry, co-founding Symbian in 1998. Software written by his teams has been included on half a billion smartphones. He has chaired London Futurists since 2008 and is the author of 11 books on futurist and techno-progressive topics such as the singularity principles. Our guest today is Professor Jeffrey Lifa and focuses on new technologies that emerge and diffuse as a professor and consultant. He is one of the first to recognize the potential for smartphones during the late 1990s and early 2000s in Japan. He earned the NTT Docomo Mobile Science Award in 2004. Hi, Jeffrey. Can you give us a brief introduction to who you are and what you do?
Yes, I go way back. David and I are probably about the same age. My whole life has been with technology, beginning with an education in physics and engineering, and probably in the Amir, you mentioned that I was studying the mobile internet in the late 1990s and involved with that in Japan. I was in Japan as a professor, and what probably most of you don't remember is that Japan was the first country to be successful in the mobile internet, followed by Korea. And it was many years before the rest of the world began to do things. And that's actually when David and I met when he visited Japan. And so I was one of the first to see it, the importance. I was also one of the first, along with many others in Japan, to see that an app store and apps were going to be a big deal and were really useful. And then in 2007, I moved to National University of Singapore, where I left Japan and I became involved with a lot of other technologies, and for the most part, forgot about mobile phones. And worked there for a number of years. And I taught a course on the economics of new technology that turned me into a pessimist because each year I would be teaching the course, and couldn't find a lot of new things to say. I was at a section on nanotechnology, and the next year there really wasn't much new to say. So I began to realize that there wasn't a lot of these technologies weren't going to happen in the near future. Then Moore's law slowed. Then I noticed all the startups had losses. So I became a pessimistic in the late 2010s.
That's quite interesting. I mean, since like our main topic of this series is open medical data, I know you have written an article on it. What would you define as open medical data?
Well, I think if everybody uploads their data to some common database, makes it available to everybody, that's kind of the way I see it. And in general, it's a good idea because the more data, the better. Of course, the problem is that it's not just the quantity of data, it's the quality of data. And there's a lot of people have talked about quality of data problems. Andrew Nigg, one, but many others. And so the problem is that just because we have a lot of data that's open and available doesn't mean that it's going to be useful. So we have to have a way to ensure that open data, the data that's open, is of high quality. But how do you do that? Because people don't want to spend time ensuring the data is of high quality unless they can get some benefit from it. If they're just giving it away to everybody, people don't want to give away data, first of all. But second of all, if they're going to give away data, they don't want to put a lot of work into cleaning the data before they make it available to everybody. So I see this as a problem, as a challenge, how do we ensure that the data is of high quality before it's made available to everybody? Perhaps it can be solved. I don't know. I just don't see a way that it's easily solved.
So I have an example from a few years ago about the importance of cleaning the data. There was a program released by DeepMind which did a pretty good job of lip reading from films of BBC documentaries or news programs. And it got better results than even the human lip readers. And sometimes human lip readers get a bit of audio help from what's being said, but in this case, there was no audio help at all, and the humans weren't doing a good job. But what was important is that Google needed to clean the data which was used for training before the lip reader was successful. When I say clean it, often audio and visual aren't completely in sync. And we get used to it on Zoom calls and so on, and we sort of cope with it. But if the lips are just maybe a few milliseconds removed from the right sound, it's very hard for the system to learn how to do correct lip reading. And so Google needed to put one set of AIs to work first, a different set of AIs, checking that there was good syncing. I'm not quite sure how they did that, and I'm sure there was effort involved before the training system worked and was able to come up with information on new ones. So it underscores your point. Raw data often isn't particularly good, and if you try and train a system based on raw data, you don't get great results. And finally, it's expensive to clean up the data.
Yeah, so that's a challenge.
So, where do you think? Do you have any ideas for how people can be incentivized, or let's talk practically. What when we say data isn't clean for medical data? What's the kind of examples of uncleanliness? Is it handwritten notes that don't make so much sense? Is it a loose language? Is it, or is it that the data isn't properly correlated, so it might be misaligned in some sense?
I've seen things written by Andrew Nigg many times, and he talks about the need to clean the data. And its incentives are a challenge because I suppose if you have organizations are allowed to access other data if they upload data and if the data is of high quality. So for someone to participate, to be able to gain access to the data, they have to do certain things that will ensure that the data is has been cleaned. And if other people, other organizations then try to access it and say, well, it's not clean, then I suppose you can go through this kind of negotiation where people get blocked if they don't provide clean data and they're allowed access if they do provide clean data. But, those kinds of things, you can do those kinds of things, they just get complicated.
I think that's the right word. Complicated. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that cleaning data isn't a simple thing. There's no one little bit of aerosol one can spray on the data and suddenly it magically gets better. Probably there's a whole host of contaminants, like in real world. There's a whole host of things that make our kitchens dirty, a whole host of things that make our cars rust and fall to pieces. And we need to probably have a whole discipline of cleaning data in which there's an analysis of the causes, an analysis of the types of uncleanliness that are causing the biggest problems. And it probably needs a large academic focus. Maybe somebody's going to ring in and tell us, hey, they've done a whole study on it. Maybe there's a whole journal dedicated to cleaning data. But if that's the case, it needs to be more widely announced and more people need to get involved in that field. Otherwise, the potential of machine learning for medical data is going to be held back.
Well, certainly there are people to do research on this who do research on data cleaning. So there's probably a set of good practices, a set of accepted things that you need to do to data before you use it. So it may not be a hard problem to solve.
So if enough money was available, it could be possible to solve it.
Well, it's going to cost money, yeah.
So it's really about the money, to be honest.
Well, there's a lot of money to be made from better data. If there is better data, people can figure out which medical treatments are more likely to be successful in particular cases, and people will pay a lot of money for getting cures. It's a huge business. So I think we need to figure out ways to divert some of this cost savings or the patient willingness to pay. That needs to have some financial engineering so that some of it can come out and benefit the people who are putting in the effort to clean the data. So that's a different kind of complication, a different kind of engineering. It's not medical data engineering, it's financial systems engineering.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, moving on to one of the things, Jeffrey, you wrote in your article is that you mentioned that verification is needed before new AI systems can be implemented, and that open access is a prerequisite for it. Can you elaborate more on this subject? Like, what do you mean by verification?
This sounds like open access not to the data, but open access to the algorithm. That instead of a company saying, trust us, we've got this clever algorithm, Maybe it's open to audit by external uh, auditors.
No, no, you're right. A lot of these algorithms aren't open; they're black boxes, and this has been a problem. So a lot of us will say we don't want to use this because we don't understand how it works, and until we understand how it works, we're not going to use it. So certainly, we need to get past that stage. We need to get move towards a stage where hospitals can trust the algorithm because they believe that the algorithm is actually doing something that's useful, that makes sense, that will likely lead to a good decision. And so that, of course, requires an open algorithm, something open, so that it's not a black box. So that certainly is one of the reasons why people have wanted to move towards open data, because they look at some of these systems that don't work very well. Oftentimes, they don't know if they work well. They just know they don't provide good results, and they don't know why they produce good or bad results because there's no explanation. It's just a black box.
And I mean, I think we should push this hard. We being the whole industry, it must demand a clearer understanding of how these algorithms work. And if there are algorithms that are mysterious, we should be resisting them because they can mislead us. They might work in some cases, but it's unclear why they work. It might work if the data has been prepared in a particular way, but nobody knows that particular fact. And then later on, other data which hasn't been prepared in exactly that same way, the wind's blowing differently, it's Thursday rather than a Friday, who knows, then the data leads to poor recommendations. So we must not be misled by the fact that some algorithm seems to have a good track record. That seeming is not enough in my view.
Oh, I agree. I agree that many of these algorithms don't work well, and they've been implemented without proper verification. So that's one of the motivations for moving to this open data, moving to a different approach where the data is open. So now we can understand better how it's making decisions, based on what data and what algorithm it's using. So, yeah, I agree that we need to move in this direction.
Yeah, so on this on the aspect of these algorithms is that the issue is really about the models. Well, that these firms that many firms sell models with poor performance, and that we could not test it without the open access to the algorithm. However, you also mentioned that, let's say there is open access, that it can only identify problems with performance and that it cannot solve them. How is it possible that it doesn't solve? Because like when we identify problems, it's almost like half of the job. So like, how doesn't it help us to solve the problems, Jeffrey?
Well, I think Jeffrey has a good understanding of this. It is that AI isn't anything like so well understood as people like to claim. AI sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, and people like to put a brave face on things and say, "Sure, we know why it works," but in reality, it's often quite mysterious behind the scenes.
Yeah, I agree.
So you talk about poor performance, Amir, and it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
It's variable performance. Sometimes it works apparently very nicely, and you can look at the statistics, and the AI does seem, in certain circumstances, to be better than humans in two aspects. First of all, it's missing fewer cases that where there is a disease, which a human may have missed, and secondly, it's also having fewer false alarms. And that's wonderful because simultaneously it's improving in both these quadrants, the type 1 error and type 2 errors that statisticians talk about. But then, if the data is different, some circumstances not clear, then both these parameters can go haywire. And so it's not just poor, it's inconsistent. And it's because the models haven't clearly understood what is it about their data which means that it's going to work well, and what is it about the data that will give these wrong, misleading results.
Okay. And so how do we then make sure that, at least on the part of the consistency of the data, that we get it right? How do we make sure that you mentioned pushing for more open access and like more accurate and clean data. How do we make sure that this does happen then?
Well, I think it will be hard to do because the people who provide data want something back from that. And they probably want other people to provide some data. and good data. And so they're going to be looking at what other people are providing. If other people are providing good data, okay, they want to participate. But if other people are holding back, so it's going to be a lot of give and take. And big hospitals, big healthcare organizations say we don't need anybody else. We don't need open data. We can do it ourselves. It's going to be the small players who are going to want the open data, but then they will have little to offer. It kind of reminds me of these. Well, I was going to say standards games. It's like standards where you have to come to some agreement, and a lot of the big players want to do things themselves because they can push it through. They have enough market clout to push it through, and it's only the small players. So there's going to be this kind of negotiation, this give and take to get it to work, and we'll see.
I feel it's a bit like paying taxes. None of us really like paying taxes if we feel we're the only one contributing. But when we have the confidence that everybody else is pitching in a fair share, we say, yeah, these taxes are good because it enables the government to do things which the free market wouldn't do by itself. But it does depend on you perceiving that there aren't too many free riders around. And so, likewise with data sharing, if you just give your data away to some indeterminate place and it's unclear that there's sufficient rewards coming, you're not going to be motivated. But when there is a standard agreed and there's even some compliance officers, then perhaps it will accelerate.
No, that's a good analogy. Yeah, people want to be treated fairly.
Yeah, and so do you then think that, like, like, obviously then policymakers have a very big job here to do to make sure that everybody is included, and that it can run smoothly. What do you think on the aspect of policymakers?
Well, I think that many policymakers don't want to get into the details, and they have to in order to come to an agreement, in order to get people to agree. It's too easy to say. What policymakers want to do is they want to put out a law that says you must upload your data, and people are going to say, "Well, wait a minute, we'll see what other people do." And then they'll look at data and say, that data is no good. Why should I upload my data? So it's going to be hard. A lot of policymakers, they like these kinds of, we need to make the data open. We need to share. They like to say things like that, but it's going to require a lot more work than that. So I'm not very optimistic that policymakers are going to exhibit the degree of competence and knowledge that they need to in order to come up with a good solution.
Have you any feeling for which policymakers around the world are doing a job a bit better than others? Because often when I travel around the world, people point to where you are, Jeffrey, Singapore, and say, hey, these guys seem to understand the technology better than many other politicians.
Well, Singapore is a country where where the government tends to come up with some good general solutions, and people tend to follow them. People tend to trust the government. There's a lot of trust here, much more than in America. So yeah, you're right. It's probably more likely to succeed in Singapore than in other countries. And maybe that's what will happen. This isn't going to be some data sharing agreement at a global level. It's going to start at local levels, and local entities are going to come to agreements and they're going to share. And then perhaps over time, it evolves from a local to a global kind of phenomenon.
I've heard it said that another country where the citizens tend to trust their government is China. And China has obviously a huge population. So potentially China might come up with better healthcare solutions. And then the rest of the world will say, I wish we were part of that as well.
Yeah, that could be.
Okay, so like in terms of these small quantity of people working together, as you mentioned, on the local level, and then rising up to maybe like higher regional and continental and maybe even global levels. Seeing the examples we have today, what makes you like, what is one of the most important factors that make you so pessimistic about the future of a global open medical data situation?
Well, I think a lot of big organizations don't want to have anything to do with these agreements. I think that the biggest organizations, the big tech companies that nobody likes, these types of companies, they don't want to participate. Now, maybe, and it could be that even big hospitals don't. If you're a very big hospital chain like Kaiser Permanente, where you have all kinds of economies of scale, you can share just in Kaiser Permanente and get a long ways. So big users, not just big tech companies, but big users will probably be less interested in doing this. And perhaps it'll work in Singapore where it's a lot of small players who just share locally.
Okay, and but the thing is as you know, as per my understanding, is that with open medical data, I thought that these big medical firms were the ones that were to gain the most because with accurate data, with more data, they could actually even gain a lot more profit by using the proper techniques and proper medicine, etc.
Yeah, yeah, they do. But some of them, some health organizations are much bigger than others, and the ones who are very big see themselves as having a lot of scale advantages and being able to have access to much more data than other organizations.
Uh, and data whose provenance they can feel confident about because it's originated within their own organization. So at least they've got visibility of where it comes from and what complications there might be. Whereas if you open it to larger interactions, you don't know more about the provenance there, or you know where it comes from, but you don't know the conditions under which it's being gathered. So this comes back to your point, Jeffrey, that the aspects of the data that lead to better solutions aren't just more of it, it's the quality of it. And I think there is some evidence from recent modeling, recent checks of models in AI that just data size itself is no longer the key determinant as people once thought. There used to be this principle, the unreasonable effectiveness of large data, riffing off a famous paper by the physicist Eugene Wigner in 1963, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Well, people were surprised at first that all you needed to do was have more and more data feeding into language models and it was more reliable without having to go to the effort of figuring out the best algorithms. But maybe that's come to an end. And these other parameters are more important, which is why these large companies are less keen just to indulge in a apparent free for all exchange.
Yeah, it could be. It could be that they're beginning to recognize that having lots more data when it's not clean data is not helping them. So maybe they'll be willing to participate in these activities.
Yeah, I wanted to also like touch upon another article that I had seen is also on this amount of data in regards to medicine and how people actually think that also like a lot of data and with the help of AI actually that medicine will so that with the help of AI that medicine will actually be better. But I hear you're also pessimistic on that subject.
You mean sharing data to develop new drugs?
Yeah, exactly. Or and with the help of AI.
Oh, you mean using AI to develop drugs? Okay. Yeah, I'm because I think that a lot of the advances in AI have been for protein folding, and what the drug development people are saying is that protein folding is a small part of drug development. So the big impact there won't be a big impact of AI on overall drug discovery. Most of the time it takes to develop a new drug is not doing the protein folder. It isn't even coming up with the drug candidate. It's testing. So the only way that AI will have a big impact on drug discovery is if you not only can discover new drugs fast, but you can discover drugs that then work out in the testing better than the other drugs worked out. So you have to be able to increase that percentage of successful drugs tested. So that's going to be hard to do. It might. We're not going to find out for 5 or 10 years, and probably then we'll realize that it's been a very small impact because it only reduced some of the time, a small amount of time it took to discover that drug. But the drugs that it discovered aren't really testing as well as any other drugs.
One argument is that the AI can help to identify possible repurposing of drugs that are already known to be safe. Because many drugs go through this period in which they are tested for safety and they are proven to be safe, and then they fail to be efficacious. There isn't enough evidence that they actually help. So these drugs are then discarded for that purpose, but their details are still online. And then software afterwards can figure out from a knowledge of their chemistry whether they might be applicable to a different kind of medical intervention. So we've had instances of anti-diabetes drugs being flagged up as potential good antibacterial agents. And heaven knows this is a big problem. There are more superbugs that are developing resistance to our existing antibiotics. And so that should shortcut some of the testing. It still won't guarantee that the new drug will be efficacious, but it means that the phase can develop later. And I know there are many companies looking at this, and I think some of them are likely to come up with some good results. But indeed, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, certainly it's the case that using AI for drug discovery, it's going to mostly result in drugs that are small, aren't changed a lot from other drugs. It's not going to lead to the big breakthroughs. It's going to lead to drugs that are slightly different than another one. But as you say, in some cases that may be valuable because it may be that you just have to make some tweaks here and there. And this is how engineering and science has worked for a long time. In that a lot of engineering analysis tweaking things. You know, it's not the activities that actually come up with the breakthroughs. It's just tweaking something you have to try to get a little better performance out of it. So yeah, AI may do that.
The other thing AI can do is rather than verifying that existing drugs whose properties are well known might fit into biochemical reactions, occasionally they can suggest brand new molecules that have never been synthesized before, de novo. And they do that a bit like some of the generative AI today. It generates pictures that nobody's ever seen from a definition. It's got this generative adversarial networks, and nowadays there's something else called diffusion models, or occasionally old style genetic algorithms. And so in these cases, the argument is that the chemical that's identified, which has never existed before, will be a better fit than any other chemical. And so if that is then proven to be safe, it's more likely to go through that second phase more quickly. It's not guaranteed. There still will be failures, but as you said, there may be a lesser failure rate. And that could be very significant as well. So I have some hopes that that should be explored further. It's a different part of AI, rather.
Yeah, it could be. And I'm certainly more optimistic about some of these things than the breakthroughs like IBM Watson and self driving vehicles and things like that. You know, using AI in drug discovery, it's really an augmented game. It's another tool that we're giving scientists to come up with new drugs. I know I think of it as like computer aided design. You know, we came up with these computer aided design tools for mechanical engineers. It came up for chip designers from way back, and they never completely revolutionized mechanical design or electrical design. They never did that, but they help. And I kind of see the same thing with AI. It will help. It's not going to be some big revolution, but it will help. It will slightly reduce the cost and over time, but it's not going to be anywhere as big as some of these people think it's going to be.
Can we inspire you to say more about IBM Watson's medical interventions? And I mean, you must have watched that carefully over many years. Were you ever persuaded that IBM's Watson could read medical reports and come up with new insights as a result?
Well, I thought that it would be kind of an augmentation tool. I thought it would the doctor would interact with it and ask questions, and the doctor would use the system to get ideas. I never saw it as replacing the doctor, but to get ideas. Maybe hard to solve cases. There was a case and the doctor couldn't figure it out, and the doctor's like, well, "What's going on? I don't seem to see what's going on. Maybe is there some obscure paper that is relevant here?" And so that's what I thought that the IBM was doing, but I'm not sure they were doing that.
I see. So it's like a better search engine that when you and I might want to try and find out.
Yeah, kind of a better search engine. Yeah, yeah.
And if what you're saying is true, then it won't be that doctors are replaced by AIs, but it may be the case that doctors who have good proficiency and understanding of AI, the details of it, will replace the doctors that don't have that knowledge and proficiency. Not that we want doctors to be replaced, but heaven knows the world needs more doctors and better doctors and doctors who are able to get results more reliably and more quickly.
Okay, and so Jeffrey, you mentioned about the actual role of AI now about both open medical data and in drug discovery, and like how it's something that helps with the procedures and with the processes. What do you think would actually be would play the biggest role in open medical data for one and drug discovery for the other?
What do I think would play the biggest role in determining? You mean what in terms of like an organization or factors?
Well, in successful open medical data procedures, so that we could all benefit from it. So open medical data, open access in for the algorithms or just in general open medical data, it's AI plays a role. It's a role that helps within this procedure. But what do you think that plays the biggest role is obviously it's either policymakers or the big tech firms.
Well, it's getting these organizations to agree on how to share the data, on how to make sure the data is cleaned and works right, and giving the right incentives for organizations to clean the data and to upload data.
Okay, and I mean this would then be one of the it would be pretty much a very big job for the policymakers. But then with policymakers, you then need people that know the technical know-how to be able to implement this. So then we get into a sort of a or sort of slippery slope where they need to do this, but they don't know how to.
No, we do. We need policymakers who are proficient, and a lot of them. I think a lot of they think of AI in such general terms of, oh, this is, they really think that the AI system is really intelligent. They don't realize that it's just data statistics, it's data analysis, it's a lot of curve fitting. It's not really an intelligent system. And so I think we're still, it's only recently that policymakers have realized that, oh, this isn't as intelligent as I thought it was.
I think education is part of the answer here. We have to have more courses that combine technical aspects with regulatory aspects. And so people are comfortable in both fields. But I don't think it's all the answer, because if people are good at the technical side, they're likely to be persuaded to get a job that actually creates the technology rather than regulates the technology. Why? Because it's better paid in most cases, and the possibility to have stellar salaries. Whereas the ones who end up in regulatory may be the ones who couldn't have good enough grasp of the technology. So they're second rate, dare I say it. Be careful. I don't want to generalize too much. I'm sure there are some regulators who have got excellent knowledge and better motivations. But sadly, we are all motivated at different times of our life to get the job with a higher salary rather than do the thing that might be better for society. So I think governments need to help out here and ensure that some of these key roles, if they really are going to make the critical difference, are well remunerated.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of truth to what you're saying.
So Jeffrey, well, this is on the open medical data aspect, and with drug discovery, what do you think is it the same? Would you say that it's the same player as that plays the biggest role aside from AI? Because as you mentioned, AI is not this revolutionary thing that will be the next big thing in drug discovery, but it will help, but it's not the biggest thing. So what would you say that plays the biggest role in drug discovery, since it's not AI?
Well, it's still testing. It's still doing these tests, and they take so long, these tests, and so many drugs don't pass. So to figure out a way to do tests faster and figure out a way to um, have a higher percentage of the drugs actually work in the tests. But those are things that I think that people have been working on for years and have understood and struggled with.
I think there's another aspect of the importance of openness here, which is that companies in big pharma need to be more open about telling people what failed. And the risk is that two different pharma companies will both spend a lot of effort testing the same kind of thing, and both of them will independently discover it's a failure. And if there'd been more knowledge shared up front, then the second or third pharma companies wouldn't waste so much effort. And they may say, well, we still think this is going to work, but we're not going to do it quite in the same way we had it first in mind. But it's very hard for companies to be candid about their failures like this. They want to keep that knowledge to themselves often. So I think, again, policymakers must mandate publication of bad results as well as publication of good results. If people only publish the good results, then we get a misleading picture, because if the p-value is what, 1 in 20 or 1 in 50, if you publish a result that's statistically significant up there, well, if you do 100 such tests, you're going to naturally get 2 that go through. Whereas if you had all the failures published too, then people would realize, hey, we need a different approach in this case.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and well, Jeffrey, you mentioned about like this. You said testing is one of the most important things, and obviously openness about these tests are also really important. I want to actually make a remark about how you said that it takes a long time and a lot of these tests fail. I want to make a remark to the COVID-19 epidemic with the vaccination, with the vaccine that was developed. Do you think we can actually look at it as an example? Because I know that a vaccine takes years to develop, takes years to test, and then it's seen if it gets approved or not. However, with the COVID-19, with Moderna and the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine, they were surprisingly really fast with from testing to I mean, from development to testing to production, and well, the entire process was really fast. So, do you think we can learn from that? And how do you think we could apply that to future drug discovery, openness, and open medical data?
My understanding is that the speed came from mRNA, so it's a different type of vaccine than we've developed, drug companies developed in the past. So it's an approach that's faster than the previous vaccine development approaches. However, it's also has resulted in vaccines that don't work as well as the ones in the past. So if you look at the vaccines that we give to our kids, I mean, when my son was young, he had, he's 9 now. He probably, when he was 1 or 2 or 3, he probably had 10 different vaccines. And there's absolutely no chance he's going to get any of those sicknesses. But yet, a lot of people who took these mRNA vaccines got COVID. Myself, my wife, other people. So there's that trade-off that they're faster to develop, but they don't work as well, and and that's part of the reason why there's been this resistance, because the vaccines don't work as well, and uh, so it may be that we can learn something, but it's hard to say.
I think it is a good example because people at first were screaming, release the vaccines early. It's going to make such a difference. But some of the vaccines failed their trials altogether. Some of the ones developed in France or Germany didn't come up with good enough results in the end. They were even poorer than the ones that we did release. And if we had released the vaccines earlier, there'd probably be even more vaccine skepticism, which is still around. People keep saying, a small minority of conspiracy theorists, and some people honestly believe that some of the vaccines are causing many people to die of deep vein thrombosis or something else. So I'm glad that we didn't cut the corners too much. I'm glad that we accelerated and focused on it, but that we still insisted on reasonable standards before making the vaccines generally available. So I think we can speed up a bit. It's appropriate to figure out if there's some way to parallelize the various phases so they don't have to run in sequence. When you have some confidence that an earlier phase is likely to succeed, that might accelerate things a bit.
Well, but like, obviously with testing is comes the access to these tests. So what do you think if like, these, let's say we have all these tests and or they are being done and they are shared on an open medical data platform?
Yeah, that's very hard. It's going to be very hard to do, because these companies have been competing for so long, and they tend to believe in that competition is the best way to do things, and so to try to get them to cooperate more, uh, maybe on some things like data, but it'll be hard. It'll be hard to get them to cooperate more. This immediately brings on arguments about capitalism versus socialism, and uh, people get very emotional about this type of thing.
Do you have strong views on that? Where do your instincts push you, Jeffrey, on that discussion?
Well, I just know that people get very emotional and argue. It could be that if some of these companies were a little more cooperative, that a little more that the things that there's be a way to improve things, but it's hard to say. Companies, for example, standards. Companies cooperate to develop standards because they're in their interest. And so, if it was really in a few companies' interest to collaborate, they would probably figure out a way to collaborate. So the governments didn't tell companies to collaborate on standards. The companies figured that on their own. So I I don't think that I think that if more collaboration in drug discovery worked, then we would see some of it. Right? We see some of these big pharma companies letting big small biotech companies do some of the work, and then they do the last part. So there has been this division of labor that you could call collaborative that goes on. And I think these companies are always looking for ways to reduce the cost of development because it is expensive. But it's hard to come in and tell them, well, why don't you do this and that? Because they usually don't want to do that.
Is there an analogy here with the industry that you and I used to study, Jeffrey, this smartphone industry? There was a while when there was so many different operating systems, and even the operating systems that existed came in different variants. And people used to say, well, come on, we need some better standardization here. And there were lots of initiatives, some various Linux initiative that, Linux initiative something else, Java initiatives here, and none of them succeeded until finally, let's give credit to Google and Android, they managed to come up with a platform which was good enough. So it wasn't just we need to cooperate. It was here's something practically that is good enough and enabled people to more quickly build apps and distribute apps. And also, perhaps, in just extending this thought a little bit more, Google made money out of this not by selling phones. They made money out of it in a different way, which was collecting data for their advertising. So turns out that they had a different financial model. They weren't even trying to make money by selling their platforms. There was no licensing fee. The stuff was given away free. So it may be that we need to wait for something that is good enough to make the other companies throw in the towel and say, we're not going to do it our way anymore. We're going to cooperate with you.
Yeah, you're right. I remember WAP. It was called WAP, Wireless Automation Protocol, that was supposed to be the standard that was going to make the mobile internet services work in the early 2000s. And in Japan, there was a service provider by the name of KDDI that made it work, that basically forced all the phones to be made according to the same kind of WAP protocol. But in Europe and outside of Japan, in Europe and America, it didn't work. The phone manufacturers wouldn't do what the service provider said, and so the phones didn't communicate properly, and it didn't work. So it's an incentive issue, coming up with an incentive that causes these companies to collaborate more.
I think WAP wasn't quite good enough. I'm not sure how well it worked in KDDI in Japan, but most people in the rest of the world felt that WAP was a poor relative of what might be possible with web access.
Yeah. It was also Korea. I think Korea used WAP and it succeeded.
So coming back to the message, it's complicated. We shouldn't expect somebody to come in with a magic wand and solve this. We have to have multiple efforts tried, and then we, in the end, need to have some humility to say, right, this is working over here. It's not what I first had in mind, but let's say cooperate on that. So I'm a big fan of the message of cooperate before competing. In fact, to speak personally, this was the message of the company that I helped co-found, Symbian. We chose the name Symbian with reflection on symbiosis or symphony to help these big guys still compete, They could put different user interfaces on the phones. They could have different apps. They could plug in different middleware. But the operating system solved some of their problems, at least for a while.
Yeah, well, we'll see. People are going to keep trying to come up with other ways, more collaborative techniques for reducing drug costs and other development costs.
Okay. Well, to kind of like wrap it up a little bit, I wanted to ask you what we need to do for open medical data to actually get better in terms of usage. We need these big tech firms to cooperate, and these firms can only cooperate when there's enough incentives, and they have to be, like done by policymakers that have enough knowledge about AI and about open medical data to pretty much do this. Am I correct?
Yeah, I would agree with you, except I would add the big hospitals in there, big healthcare organizations in America. These are very profitable firms in America.
And does that include the insurance providers? Because I guess the hospitals, Kaiser Permanente is insurance as well as healthcare, isn't it?
Yes, yes, they're all in this. Well,
Okay.
good
And
luck.
do you have any last words that you wanted to out there, Jeffrey? Will make you more optimistic in the future.
The optimism is going to come from seeing things in the real world that are making a difference rather than just hearing clever marketing spins. So let's get on with real solutions.
Thank you for listening to the Delta Dialogue. This episode is brought to you by the UN, a tech community focused on artificial intelligence in healthcare, machine learning, and related disciplines. I am Emir Mustafa, and see you next time.